Good morning, everyone. How's everyone doing today? I'm meteorologist Max Saparis. I'll be emceeing this event, Clean Lakes 101 Science Cafe, and we'll be hosting these monthly meetings as we go here on out. WKOW, proud sponsors with the Clean Lakes Alliance. I've helped them out in years past for other events, and I'll be emceeing these every single month now. As we're, again, proud sponsors with the organization. Additionally, through the week, just a little tidbit for you, if you're interested in seeing lake-related stories on 27 News at 6, we'll be featuring the lakes and how we're trying to keep them clean. And you can tune in either on 27 News at 6 or to WKOW.com. We'll also have those posted on our Facebook page. But for now, again, very excited to be here, very excited for our talk today. As well. Today's talk is called A New Compact for Cleaner Lakes, and that will be presented by Cassie Goodwin and Jay Blue of SmithGroup. That is an organization, that is an engineering firm out of Milwaukee that has been helping a group of 19 different organizations and agencies that are working on the Yahara CLEAN Compact. And that compact seeks to improve and protect regional water quality by strengthening community partnerships and uniting around a shared and, most importantly, a measurable set of goals. The compact also defines key roles and responsibilities of various landowners and managers within the watershed to help contribute to healthier lakes. Now, for our speakers, Jay Blue is a landscape architect and an ecologist at SmithGroup and has been working there for 20 years of experience in this. And as co-author of 2 sustainability publications, Jay's work focuses on planning and designing places at the intersection of the built environment and the natural system. Meanwhile, Cassie Goodwin is a principal civil engineer with SmithGroup, has 17 years of experience in sustainable infrastructure. She has a passion for transformational projects lying at the intersection of social justice and complex water issues. A licensed professional engineer and Envision sustainability professional, Cassie is also the co-author of the nationally award-winning UW-Madison Green Infrastructure Master Plan, if you've heard of that. Now, before we hear from both Cassie and Jay on their exciting plans, I want to first introduce Marilee Gorman with First Weber Real Estate to tell us about our sponsors today and how you can get involved with Clean Lakes Alliance. I'll be back at the end of our talk to take your questions and answers. You can see that at the bottom of your Zoom, the Q&A link. You can type in there. Don't comment in the chat that you might normally be used to on these Zooms. Again, there's a separate Q&A. It's right next to the participants tab. You can click on that, ask your questions there, and we'll try to get to as many as possible within the last few minutes. So I'll be back coming up later on, but right now, Marilee Gorman, take it away.
Thank you, Max. Good morning from Lake Monona. Before I hand things over to Cassie for today's talk, I want to thank the sponsors that make Clean Lakes 101 Science Cafe possible. Along with Johnson Financial Group, First Weber is proud to be presenting sponsors of these talks. Our supporting sponsor is National Guardian Life Insurance Company. Our usually hosting sponsor is the Edgewater, and our production partners are the University of Wisconsin Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies and the UW Extension. I also want to thank everybody who has renewed their individual friend or their business lake partner donations this year. Here is a list of our lake partners who have joined or renewed this last month. First Weber is a proud lake partner, and my husband Kevin and I are friends of Clean Lakes through the 63 Club at the Yahara Society level. In case you didn't know, the 63 Club is a recurring donation starting at just $8.63 a month. If you haven't donated to become a friend or a lake partner, please visit cleanlakesalliance.org/donate. Back to today, as Max mentioned, the title of our talk is A New Compact for Cleaner Lakes. I'm excited to hand things over to SmithGroup's Cassie Goodwin to tell us about the important work that has been done on the Yahara CLEAN Compact over the past several months.
Great. Well, thank you, Marilee, and thank you, Max. Appreciate that introduction, and we're excited to be here this morning to speak with all of you. Thank you so much for getting up and hearing this presentation this morning about this very exciting and important project. As Marilee and Max mentioned, we are SmithGroup is an engineering and design firm. We actually are based out of Madison and Milwaukee, as well as 14 other offices throughout the United States. But Jay and I spend quite a bit of time enjoying the lakes in Madison as well. So I wanted to start by just talking through a little bit about our presentation. So let me just start by sharing my screen. It always takes a second here to pull up. We're going to go through the outline of our presentation really quickly here. We're going to start by giving you a little bit of background on the state of the water quality in the Yahara Lakes. And for those of you who have attended past Clean Lakes 101 presentations, some of this may be pretty familiar to you, but we wanted to provide some of the basics and give everyone a level of understanding of kind of what we're seeing currently in the lakes in our Madison area. And then building the Yahara CLEAN Compact. This is a key point that we're going to discuss a little bit this morning is how does this coalition form and kind of what does the group make up now and what does it mean? And then we're going to talk a little bit about the work that we've been doing over about the last year or so working with the Compact around this Yahara CLEAN 3.0 action plan and how it's organized and how we are intending for that to be used going forward. And then we'll summarize with some key actions and takeaways, and then we'll take your questions. So we're hoping to get through the presentation in about a half an hour, maybe a little bit more. And so hopefully we'll have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. And I'll hand it over to Jay.
Thanks, Cassie. Well, many of you may have seen a condition like this at the lake, at one of our lakes at one time or another. As some of you are aware, there is an issue with phosphorus and E. coli and just runoff in our lakes that's been building for decades. And part of what this project is after is trying to find ways to help bring some of those systems and those loads back into a more regulated, more appropriate scale for our lakes. To be perfectly honest, none of us want to see these kinds of days at the lake. None of us want to see this kind of, and none of us want to have this kind of an experience at the lake because it smells bad, it looks bad, and who wants to crawl into a water when it looks like that, right? Part of what's causing this problem is phosphorus. And some of you may have, as Cassie has said, some of you may have seen a version of this or this very diagram before, but phosphorus is it's a nutrient. It's a naturally occurring nutrient. It is absolutely essential for many forms of agricultural production. And it's spread as in a couple different ways. We're going backwards here just for a minute, but it's spread in a couple different ways. It's spread as fertilizer for row crop, corn, soybean, that kind of production. It's also spread in the form of manure, and it is a byproduct of animal production that there is quite a bit of phosphorus in all animal waste. That's not just, we're not picking on cows, all animal waste has it, including our own, has a fair amount of phosphorus in it. But what happens is that excess phosphorus is really being placed on the landscape in lots of different forms. This happens to show it happening in an agricultural environment. It does happen in the urban environment as well. And that excess phosphorus, whatever is not captured and used by the vegetation, gets sent into the waterway system. And once it gets into our water system, there it's used by organisms that we don't want to use it, such as algae. And you end up with an image like we just saw on the previous slide, where algae is beneficially using some of that phosphorus. Or we end up with E. coli conditions where the E. coli comes up in our lakes and you're unable to use the beaches. If we look at what's been happening in the last couple of years, you can see that the number of beach closures over the last couple of years has been going up. It's steadily been rising, really focusing in on 2018, 2019, and 2020 on the right side of the slide here. What's happening there, just by way of reference, why we're seeing just a little bit of a decrease between 2018 and 2020 is that it's been drier, to be perfectly honest. 2018 was a very, very wet year. Some of you on this call probably remember, some of you may have been trapped on the west side of Madison during that storm event. And 2018 was a very, very wet year. And as we've had drier and drier years, seasonally drier and drier years between 2018 and 2020, we're seeing fewer closures. That doesn't mean the problem is getting better. That just means there's been less water, rainwater washing the problem into the lakes. And really what's been happening is that our amount of rainfall has been going up. So you can see beginning in the 1940s through the last decade here that we just passed through. That sounds weird to say, the last decade we just passed through, but yeah, in the 2010s, you can see that the amount of precipitation just in the Madison area has been steadily increasing. Now, while that's been happening, at the same time, if you look at the little image on the left-hand side, our area of imperviousness, how much of the watershed of the Yahara Lakes has become impervious or urbanized has increased significantly. And so when we do have increased rainfall, more of that is running off directly into the lakes and the lake's watershed system. So although as a result of Clean 1.0 and Clean 2.0, to be perfectly honest, the amount of phosphorus as in a unit of water, in this case, we'll say it's a gallon, in a unit of water has gone down. We've made significant increases or improvements in reducing the amount of phosphorus within a unit of water. Unfortunately, because of how our climate has been changing, the amount of water per year has been going up. So although the phosphorus amount per unit of water, per gallon of water has gone up, we're actually seeing more gallons of water. And as a result, more phosphorus is entering our lake system. So if we look at the phosphorus loading, as a result, these look at water years from a USGS gauge. A water year is basically from October 1st to September 30th is when the US Geological Society collects water data. That's what the WY stands for, is a water year. You can see that our phosphorus loading in 2017, 2018, and 2019 have all been going up. And again, keep in mind that although we're doing better at controlling phosphorus, the amount of rain is directly contributing to the amount of increase. So you can see, even though things have started to dry out a little bit between 2018 and 2019, as we saw on a previous slide, the amount of phosphorus is still increasing. The loading is still increasing year over year. And that results in some tension. Obviously, there's some, although our conservation practices have been getting better and better and better in our rural environment, and the best management practices we've been executing have been, and actually just becoming more and more sophisticated and more directed at controlling E. coli or phosphorus, or even capturing and controlling runoff. As we have continued to develop our counties and our region and the watershed area, the amount of space that farmers have to work in has gotten smaller and smaller. So you see this intensification of agriculture where they have to do more with less. They have to produce more on less space. And that's just a result of urbanization. And you can see right immediately below that, although our urban best practices, again, have been improving and improving, and we're doing a much better job of capturing, controlling, and treating stormwater runoff, or even capturing phosphorus before it enters the system in an urban environment, our urban growth has continued to just increase year over year. This is one of the fastest growing counties. Dane County is one of the fastest growing counties in the state. And that's evidenced by the recent survey that was just collected, a population survey.
Sorry, I'm trying to advance the slide. It's just taking a second here. Not sure why it's not advancing. This is Cassie. Oh, there we go. Okay. So, you know, the usability of our lakes is ultimately how we experience and how we measure the water quality, right? It's how swimmable and how fishable are our lakes, how usable are they in the summer when we want to be out there, what kind of influence do we have when, when the algae blooms happen, and the smells. And that all of that really comes back to what happens in the watershed and what happens on our landscape. Ultimately, lakes are a reflection of their watershed, and everything that we do, from individuals to our government, to agriculture, all the different elements that come into play within our watershed influence what happens in our streams, and then that influences what happens in our lakes. And then, of course, that ultimately comes down to how usable, how quality are our lakes. And the Clean Lakes Alliance, many of you likely receive this annual report, the State of the Lakes report, and it was mentioned earlier by Max on WKOW is reporting on it as well. But the Clean Lakes Alliance and the Clean Compact has been working over the years to kind of track and catalog the improvements that have been made within the watershed, as Jay just talked about, a lot of the conservation practices and best management practices that have been put in over the years. Those things are being tracked. And ultimately, we'd like to see that there's a direct correlation between all that work that's going on and how usable our lakes are. But of course, it's not an exact science. And as Jay pointed out, there's all these other factors that are coming into play, including climate change and intensification of our urban areas. Okay, I'm getting a little bit of a delay here on the slide advancing again. Trying every different option, clicking my mouse, hitting enter, advancing. I don't know what's going on here.
Do you want me to take control?
I don't know if it's, let's see if I can push this button. All right, maybe that'll work. Okay, so under, this slide is a little bit pixelated, but basically what this is it's showing that over the last 10 years or so, since the last plan that came out, Yahara CLEAN 2.0, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, there were 14 actions that had to do with phosphorus reduction, and those have been tracked over time to kind of look at how are we succeeding, where are we succeeding, and where are we maybe falling short of some of the goals and things that we've been wanting to do. And you can kind of, this is really not meant to show you the specific actions, but more that there's been tracking to see kind of, are there places in which, we've really excelled, for example, urban waterway banks and cropping and tillage practices in agricultural fields. We've really gone a long way towards the goals that we had set about 10 years ago, but in some cases we really haven't made any headway at all. So one of the things that was really important as we were looking at this next plan, CLEAN 3.0, was to start thinking about how can we look at this a little bit differently. We had these 14 actions in place. We thought that by this time we would have really made a much more difference. We would have gotten a lot further along with the water quality in our lakes if we had just done these things, but maybe we have to look at things a little bit differently. And so that's part of what we were tasked to do in working with the Yahara CLEAN Compact. But I'll talk a little bit, maybe before we get into those details, I'll talk a little bit more about the Yahara CLEAN Compact itself. So CLEAN is an acronym that stands for Capital Lakes Environmental Assessment and Needs. There's a vision for this group that all community members feel connected to, proud of, and responsible for our lakes and streams. There are 3 kind of general goals of the compact, which is clearer water, fewer cyanobacteria, that's that algae that we just talked about, blooms, and open beaches. And then the objectives associated with those goals are really what we're talking about with this plan, which is reducing phosphorus, reducing E. coli, and reducing the total amount of stormwater runoff that we are seeing in our lake system. So who is the compact? What organizations are part of it? Well, this slide kind of nicely summarizes how the group has built over the years. So starting in 2008, there were just 4 agencies involved. As the years have gone on, more and more groups have signed on to the compact. And you can see by 2021 now, we are at 19 organizations, which actually has a pretty diverse representation of groups within the watershed. So it involves the usual agencies that you would expect, such as the DNR, Dane County, City of Madison, and UW-Madison, and of course the Clean Lakes Alliance. Those are some of the main partners of the compact. But we also have a whole host of organizations, including the realtors, dairy farmers, the Yahara Lakes Association, Townsend Association, and individual different research organizations from the UW are all part of this compact, and everybody is working together to try to solve this problem for the Madison and the Dane County region, because all of these groups recognize the importance of the lakes for all of the various aspects of the economy and just the quality of life. So as Jay kind of talked about, since Yahara CLEAN 2.0 came around, which was about 10 years ago now, we have, about 10 years have gone by, and we've seen increased phosphorus, we've seen increased rainfall, we've had additional algae blooms and bleach closures. We really didn't expect those things when we put that plan out. We really expected those things to be on the decline. So we have some strong headwinds. But of course, over that time, as Jay mentioned, a significant number of conservation practices have been put in place. So there's a lot of great work that's been done. So that almost makes it even more frustrating for many people who've been involved in this is we've done all this great work, and yet we're still seeing these results. So one of the things that was really important, that when these 19 organizations came together, that they've been talking about over the last couple of years, is that they really want to make sure that this plan is fully developed through community engagement and really involves the whole community. So the mission of the Yahara CLEAN Compact will communicate with, engage, and empower diverse watershed communities to support our decision-making and plan development. That is something that we have taken into, to heart through this process and working with the compact. There have been, over this last summer, there have been quite a few outreach efforts to kind of work with, and not just over the summer, but over the last couple of years, to really start to get a better sense of what the willingness of different groups and organizations and stakeholders and people, the residents, are willing to take on, sort of the level of understanding about the lakes. We did a big survey, a public survey that recently closed. I think we ended up with about 1,600 people participated in that survey. So we have a lot of really good data about that. And then we'll continue to, as the plan rolls out, continue to have a lot of engagement and outreach to make sure that everybody feels like they are part of this process. So that's a little bit different than the way that the original plans were structured. This was the first plan that was done in 2010 with CLEAN 1.0 was really much more about government actions. It was a much more targeted plan that maybe probably didn't see the light of day for most individuals. It was much more of a kind of agency plan about how, but it was a good starting point. It had a lot of really good background and information, and really starting to think about how can we clean up our lakes. And then a couple of years later, the Yahara CLEAN Strategic Action Plan for Phosphorus Reduction rolled out, and that was a very engineering heavy driven report. There was a lot of modeling that was done to identify those 14 urban and rural actions that we kind of mentioned earlier. And the partnership did expand a little bit there, but again, it was very much focused on what can Dane County do, what can DNR do, what can the city of Madison do. So it was very focused on kind of governmental actions. And I think the main thing that we wanted to drive home with this project, and I'll go over these 14 actions. So the 2012 plan CLEAN 2.0 had these 14 actions. 4 of them were rural, 10 of them were rural, 4 of them were urban. And all of these had kind of a numeric quantity set aside to sort of, okay, here's how much phosphorus we need to do to reduce a lot of these. And some of these are still valid. There's still things that we think, need to still be incorporated into CLEAN 3.0. Some of them we've reevaluated and determined maybe they're not either doable or they're really not going to be very effective. So those are all things that we've been evaluating as we've started to build upon that. But the biggest thing I'd say is different about this plan is, instead of just sort of being driven by the science and the data, CLEAN 3.0 is really also trying to be more holistic in its implementation, in terms of outreach, and in terms of also making sure that everybody in the watershed, whether you're a developer, whether you're a farmer, whether you are a resident, whether you are someone who manages a park system, that you feel like you have an understanding of how you can contribute and how we can as a community, move it forward with the opportunity to improve the lakes together, because we believe that it's going to take more than just scientific and structural changes. We need to have political will and community will to make these changes happen, because it's going to have to be sort of, we have to move beyond the low-hanging fruit and move into the next phase of kind of big actions.
Thank you, Cassie. All right, so what should you expect from the Clean 3.0? Well, one of the big insights we had early on in the project was, as Cassie just sort of alluded to in this previous slide, this recognition that the community needs to be, this process is going to take a community. The community needs to be more involved as a whole in order for us to make real impact and real change within the watershed. So one of the big organizing differences in 3.0 is that rather than just having 70 as in 1.0 or 14 as in 2.0, big lists that say, here's what we need to have happen in the watershed, we've tried to identify actions by different stakeholder groups. And those groups, we after talking through it over the last 11 months with lots of different people, we've narrowed that down to these 5 different stakeholder groups: the agricultural group, the developers and builders, parks and open space managers, residential and commercial landowners, and government bodies. You can go to the next slide, Cassie. Within each of those different stakeholders, we've identified significant actions that any one of these stakeholders can execute that will have an impact on phosphorus, E. coli, or even reduction in runoff based on how they manage their land, or they manage their practices, or in the case of government, even policy or policy changes that would help to enact or help to change or execute change within the watershed. Of, again, the goal is about phosphorus, E. coli, and runoff control, runoff management, better runoff management. So you can see just a couple samples there of what's happening. That's okay. You can go to the next slide. We also tried to focus on helping people maybe just understand more broadly where these actions, how these actions take place. Are you preventing the source, the phosphorus source, manure or leaves, from even entering the system? Are we capturing at the source? Are we capturing it once it's on the land? Can we contain it once it's already been spread, once it's already been placed on the land, once someone's already put fertilizer on their lawn, or someone's already spread fertilizer on their row crops? Can we capture that before it gets into the waterway system? And then once it's in the waterway system, are there effective methods for us to be able to grab that, pull it back out so that it's not ultimately depositing in the lakes? So 3 different ways of us trying to identify where and how these, of cataloging these different actions about where and how we can grab phosphorus, E. coli, or prevent runoff. So you can see some examples here, whether you're spreading manure, whether you're doing some sort of stream bank restoration, or in the case of the image on the right, are you actually just doing a full-on dredge to remove the soil particles that have bound phosphorus attached to them. And then we also work to identify what we thought would be the most significant actions within the watershed. So we have the 5 stakeholder groups, and we have actions targeted at the 5 stakeholder groups. And to the extent that we could, where it made sense, we've really tried to say, here's the most important phosphorus reduction action you can execute. Here's the most important runoff reduction action you can execute. And here's the most important E. coli reduction action you can execute for any one of those stakeholders. We also tried to identify what we thought were the most significant within the watershed. And you're just seeing, I'm not going to read these to you. You're seeing some examples here of some of those most significant reduction actions that will have an impact on the watershed. Part of the, and this is, I think, our last slide. So trying to, we're working hard to get to 8:30 as we promised, to end in 30 minutes for you. Part of what is important then in this Yahara CLEAN 3.0 is this expanded toolkit, this idea of looking at investment models and policies. Certainly a coalition, as we've said before, this whole community idea is really important to the 3.0 report. And then some other key practices about, I think you've seen some of this before in earlier versions of these, of the cafe, of the Science Cafe, where Matt maybe has presented to you the significance of the winter-spring runoff period. Certainly employing reduction of runoff volumes. Climate change is having a big impact on us. Our urbanized environment is having a big impact on us. Intensified agriculture is having a big impact on when water hits the ground. We've got to find a better way of storing that. It's a fact that as we've developed the landscape, we've reduced the sponginess, the absorptive quality of the landscape to meet our development expectations and desires, or the quality of life that we want to have. And so really it's about creating this expanded toolkit that enables the stakeholders and the community at large to have a significant effect on the watershed and the outcomes of the watershed. So with that, I think Max will be helping to direct questions, and Cassie and I will go on mute and we'll be ready to help answer questions however we can.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Cassie, Jay. Great presentation of going over just, what is impacting our lakes, what we're seeing so regularly, and how we're seeing that increasing in recent years. Got a couple of questions. If you're watching right now and you're also interested in asking, go ahead, comment in the Q&A section right next to the participants tab at the bottom of your Zoom. If you just tap your phone or you see it on your computer, you'll see it there. And looks like we got one question here from John. He's asking, with less rain than last year, that seemed to make weed and algae growth worse. Seems to be due to maybe more sunlight going further into lake water and warming that water. Is it true to say that in either case, more or less rain, the situation is going to get worse over time? And John, I think this question is directed towards Jay. And Jay, you were discussing the impacts in recent years and seeing how phosphorus levels have changed with precipitation. What do you got on that, Jay?
It may, if there's enough phosphorus in the system, and just having shallower lakes would, shorelines would warm up faster. Although, if you look at if Cassie were to pan back to the data in 2015, where we had an incredibly droughty year, and we just a really, really droughty year, you'll see that lake water quality levels went way up and the phosphorus loading went way, way, way down. And so there's enough big events still happening right now where we're still getting these big flushes of phosphorus into the system, and it's still a significant loading taking place. I mean, yes, this has been drier than it was in 2018. Here we are in 2020. It was definitely dry, or 2021. It was definitely drier, but we're still getting big flushes of water. I hope that answered your question, John.
Yeah, John, feel free to comment again if you wanted to hear a follow-up on that. We'll move on to Gary. He said, have landscape contractors been encouraged to not blow grass and leaves into the street following mowing and cleaning? And I know that's something that we've been told as individuals, that's something that we could make an impact on. And that's actually our discussion for next month's talk, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But Chuck, I guess that question would be more directed to, that question coming from
Gary.
From Gary, yes, sorry, just got away from me here. But yeah, what are you thinking, Cassie?
So I think that's a really good question. And hi, Gary, good to have you on this morning. One of the recommendations that we are putting out for residential and commercial properties is to manage lawn and yard debris. So whether it be grass clippings or leaves, of course, as soon as that gets into the street and you see a big rainfall, that gets into our storm sewers. And of course, that goes directly into our lakes. So that managing those things and keeping them out of the streets is an important recommendation on the residential side. And certainly that would extend to landscape contractors. So I think it's a good comment that this report could kind of target those groups who are really influential and sort of working on private and certainly commercial properties, making sure that they know that they shouldn't be putting those things into the street.
And going along kind of with that same question, someone else was asking, is this report complete? And if so, is there a way to view it online?
Yeah, and thank you for asking that. I forgot to mention at the beginning that we are in the process of drafting the report right now, and we are going to be going through a period of time of kind of review and editing of that report. So the intent is that this will be rolled out more formally in the spring with a larger public engagement effort. I think that we have some ideas planned for how that's going to get communicated out. But right now you're kind of getting a sneak preview of what these recommendations are going to be.
All right, well, we'll be on the lookout for that then. Coming up next year, more on impacts to the lakes. Karen asking, I noticed some communities, and I've seen this out on the Yahara chain as well, they'll actually rake the shore after weeds and algae builds up. Does that raking help keep levels down, or is it kind of all for naught and kind of an uphill battle?
Yeah, Jay, do you want to take that one? I can also try to tackle it.
I mean, yeah, so it's a good question. I'm probably going to let the wind out of your sails. I mean, yes, it does help, but the amount of material that's physically removed is so small compared to the amount of phosphorus in the system. Does it help? Yes. Should it still be done? Yes, it does. It does help remove phosphorus from the system, and it is important to do. But when you look at the total size of the lakes, it's a dent in the can. It's not going to have a significant impact. If everybody in the Yahara Lakes watershed went and spent one day helping to pull that stuff out, it would have a significant impact. It'd be like if we all went and pulled garlic mustard out of a woodland area, we'd have a real impact on the garlic mustard population. But so yeah, yes, it should still be done, but it's not going to solve the problem. It's not the silver bullet.
Sorry, I'll just add one more thing. I see Mark Rydell, who's one of our Compact executive committee members, is on the call. He's from DNR, and he just said that the weeds along the shore are a potential colonization area for E. coli. So I think there's also, consideration for not kind of allowing those breeding grounds, and also it's a nuisance too for a lot of lakeshore experiences to have those floating weeds.
Right, and I'd also assume that just cleaning up the immediate shoreline enables the possibility of beaches staying open longer than, let's say, the center of the lake. So yeah, that's an interesting point from Mike about the zebra mussels. Chuck asking, does this Clean 3.0 address, where did it go? Let's keep popping away. Oh, does it address minimizing salt use on roads or driveways? Because that we've thought about as well, percolating into the lakes too.
Yeah, it not directly. I mean, certainly roadway salts. That's a chloride issue. That's not a phosphorus or an E. coli issue. I think I'm seeing Adam would like to weigh in on this too. Go ahead, Adam.
Oh no, he's just moving them into the answered column.
Oh, got it. So, okay, got it. I'm sorry. No, I misunderstood what was happening there on my screen. Misinterpreted that. Apologies all. So does it have an impact? Yes. Chloride issues definitely have an impact on the lakes, and it certainly affects how phosphorus and other nutrients in the lakes will behave. And in fact, on much smaller water bodies, chlorides are definitely a reason why there's lot fewer days of ice skating, because with enough salt in the system, your lakes and ponds don't freeze at the same rate and the same level. And that has a different impact on how much water is being lost to evaporation, how much water is being stored over winter. But the 3.0 report is, to be clear, it is really directed at phosphorus, E. coli, and runoff reductions. Those are the three primary target areas that we're trying to address.
But I think, Max, one of the important things for everybody to remember is that we want more people doing more things, even if it's year round. So if we can get the awareness out there that everything that's put on the ground ends up either in the lakes or the aquifer, right? And so think about a cultural shift of like what we've done with recycling over the last 10, 20, 30 years. We've had a huge community shift thinking about recycling all the time. It's in all the stores, it's in all of our kitchens, it's on our garages, our offices, our parks. We want that same thing, thinking about everything that goes on the ground ends up in the lakes, and get that out there. So Clean Lakes Alliance will talk about salt But we also want people to understand that salt doesn't create algae. Salt does create problems, and we're concerned about those things. But I think if everybody realizes, whatever you put on the street, however, whatever you put on your lawn, what everybody throws out their car when they're driving, like cigarette butts, everything that ends up on the land eventually ends up in our lakes if we don't do something about it. I think we want to build a broader coalition and change the cultural mindset to respect our lakes more.
Yeah, and that kind of leads into this next question that we have from John. It's kind of pointed to me, but Jay, you can take this too. So talking about flushing events, so again, the increase of runoff from higher rain events. With climate change, are we going to see more of those? It's posed to me, but again, Jay, you were talking about this too. Jay showed off a graph that showed by decade how much our precipitation amounts have increased any given, for the decade. So even though, yes, these last couple of years, we've had a little less rain, especially this year with our drought, the trend is showing that we are going to increase the rain totals overall, and that is a symptom of climate change. So that's my 2 cents on it. But Jay, you can add a little bit more to that too.
Yeah, I mean, I think anytime we have these gigantic flushes, we're going to see these. It remobilizes material that was under a smaller event might not be mobilized. So when we have a big event like 2018, and as a result of climate change, where you have such a severe storm event, material that was essentially held in place in the landscape or less mobile in the landscape because it was even higher up, it was in a spot that was less likely to be flooded. Those types of events are going to grab content, soil particles, leaf material, debris, and remobilize that, put it back in a situation where it's in flow, it becomes flocculent, and that all ends up at the lakes. So anytime we have these larger and increasing flashier events, and flashier, the trend for climate change is that the storms are going to get bigger and they're going to be more intensive. And anytime we have those bigger, more intensive storms, the probability of failure or like a subsidence of soil or something like that as a result of flooding in an area that on the landscape that historically wouldn't be exposed to that depth or that rate of flow goes up, and then we have these big flushes of material into the lakes.
I think that's a good point. We've built out our cities, our homes, and our agricultural fields for the most part to saying, hey, get the rain away from my home, off of my agricultural fields, and get it away from me as fast as possible and put it into a larger system. I think, we've started this process of sort of rebuilding our infrastructure, whether farms are trying to keep more soil in place, so they're gonna have to have bigger berms. They're gonna have to keep that soil in place. They're gonna have to reimagine what agriculture looks like. We're gonna have to reimagine what our homes look like. Hey, maybe we should build a rain garden. Maybe we can find ways to keep the water on our own property in rain barrels so we can reduce the amount of the flashiness of this. And so if we can all work together to make small actions, whether is it agriculture to keep some of that water in certain areas and rethink what that looks like, to the parking lot at West Town and East Town Mall, where you got those big solid surfaces, we probably can't rebuild those things again. And, the idea of pushing the water off of our homes and into the stormwater system, maybe build a rain garden and put native plants in there for birds, bees, and butterflies, put a rain barrel in there. That's going to reduce the amount of runoff, which carries all those bad things right into the lakes.
And Ben's question here has a little bit more to do with infrastructure as well, James. Thanks for that. He's asking, do we have a good handle on why we aren't seeing more residential green infrastructure projects? Is this related to education and outreach, funding, or other? And I think Cassie might have more on that.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. There are certainly green infrastructure pilot programs that have been happening throughout the city of Madison over the years. I know there's one kind of in the Westmoreland neighborhood that's been going on, and there's been others in residential areas, primarily working with the city. Part of it is probably related to cost. I imagine that, most people don't have a whole lot of extra money sitting around to kind of dig a big hole in their yard and implement it. But I think also part of it is just awareness and understanding, or the kind of the willingness to kind of convert areas of their property to kind of managing stormwater is not something that is typically a high priority, but it is something that we are including in our recommendations within Clean 3.0, is for people to take individual actions on their property, not only because it does make a cumulative difference if everybody, if a large percentage of people were to do these things, but also because we believe that it really does kind of help build stewards, that if they're taking individual actions on their own properties, they're also more likely to advocate and push for policies and larger initiatives within the watershed, and kind of have a greater voice for the lakes.
Yeah, good point, Cassie. I think that, people make cultural changes for different things. When you early on, you would get a rebate to put a light bulb in, right? Remember, we know we had that. That's one thing. You could get a credit through some sort of through the government. Sometimes it's because your neighbors do it. Sometimes it's because you're proud and you can put a sign and start, and you're part of a movement. So we'll be looking at all those different triggers, whether it's communication, incentives, cultural norms. And we have a program called Resilient Landscapes, which gives us sort of the top 10 things that you can do at your home to protect the lakes. But I think the idea that SmithGroup had is to really pump that up and look at the different ways and why people make a change. Sometimes it's financial, sometimes it's their neighbors, sometimes it's education, and we'll be moving all those levers forward.
All right, thanks for that. Next couple questions have to do more specifically about the lakes and the pollutants going within them. I'll kind of combine these two. One is from Chuck, the other is from, well, I'll just start with Chuck's. How about that? Does Clean 3.0 address the recent Suck the Muck dredging project in terms of phosphorus reduction by removing phosphorus-laden soils? And then the other question is from Lance. Just in recent years, are we actually taking more of those weeds out of the lake? And then what's being done with that product? Is there a biodigestion initiative there? That's a good question. I don't know what does happen to all that we take out.
So, we're not necessarily experts in sort of the weed management side. I know the county handles that. So if there's somebody else on the call who knows the answer to that, feel free to add that into the chat or the Q&A. I don't know if I have the answer to what happens to the weeds once they're harvested. And I think we addressed that a little bit earlier. I guess related to the Suck the Muck, I mean, certainly that has to do with kind of what Jay described earlier, of actually removing the phosphorus laden soils once they're in the water body. So that's kind of that third step in kind of the recommendations that we are putting together for this 3.0. And while we're not necessarily specifically addressing Suck the Muck in this plan, I mean, we do have recommendations in there for the county and for other governmental entities to participate or continue to participate in those types of activities as there is a need. So
I think that the other thing that's worth noting is that, generally speaking, and so I want everyone to understand what I'm about to say is a general, there will be exceptions to what I'm about to say, but generally speaking, the most cost-effective methods for controlling E. coli, phosphorus, and runoff reduction happen before the material hits the land. So if we are managing phosphorus at its source, that's a much more cost-effective and probably more significant impact in the long term for phosphorus reduction than once it's in the lakes or in the watershed. That's much harder. It becomes more complicated and more costly, and just it's more labor intensive to remove that content once it's in the water. Not at all saying that we shouldn't still do that, but think of it this way, that if we look upstream, up watershed to where it's happening. The leaves on your yard, are they in the street, or are they in the gutter, or are they in the yard? That will have, for your bang for your buck, that will have a more significant impact than an operation like Suck the Muck. Doesn't mean it still shouldn't happen, but keep that in your quiver as you try to understand the recommendations that will come out. The sooner you can grab that material, phosphorus, E. coli, or rainwater when it hits the ground, the sooner you can intercept rainwater and control it, the more cost effective it typically is to do that management right where it's happening, not after it's in the water.
We actually have a little bit of a follow-up. We have Laura from the Land and Water Resources Department about what happens to the weeds once they're taken out. They're actually, the aquatic plants are composted, she says, combo of native plants and invasive species. So the county can partner with others that are interested in receiving those aquatic plants for compost. So there already is a plan in place for that. So that's good to see. More on what Jay and James were saying about making these initiatives before the content even reaches the ground. Carolyn asking, what efforts are being made with farmers on this plan, since ag is a big contributor to phosphorus and sediment loading? Is there are there big game changers being pushed? And she mentions pasturing cow dairy and moving away from nothing but corn and soybean growth. Anyone have an answer on that?
So ag has been a big part of this plan. We have had multiple engagement processes. In fact, we really didn't talk much about the public engagement process. We went through a very intensive public engagement process through the whole summer, which included engagement with the agricultural community in lots of different ways. That engagement included individual farmers, people, consultants in the field, on the farm with the farmers, walking and talking with farmers. It included meeting with farming groups. It included meeting with the resource providers to farmers, the organizations that are delivering the feed or delivering the fertilizer to the farms. So really trying to touch that sector from lots of different ways and ensure that they are part of the process. And more can be talked about this as well, but the Clean Compact itself has also had a long history of reaching out and engaging the farmers and asking the farm community to be part of the change. This is not a dictum to farms to say this is what needs to happen. We're looking for partnerships with that community, and we've been working hard to make sure that that's happening. So that's part one to answer that question. What was I sort of lost my train of thought. What was the second part of that?
Second part was whether there were any big changes being pushed, such as even kind of changing the crop rotation, the types of crops that are being planted.
And the answer is yes. Clean 3.0 does have some big recommendations, and to be clear, some of those big recommendations are costly. I think part of what it is, as folks on this call would probably recognize, is a complicated issue. So when we want to develop more space, we are typically developing space in a rural environment. And when we do that, invariably farmers are losing pasture space for cows. So, if we're asking them to do more on less, it becomes harder and harder. But certainly grazing is a mechanism for, reducing the confined feedlots and those types of situations to enable a better distribution of resources across a field through a grazing process. That's absolutely appropriate. There are other big recommendations that the plan is making. One of the things that came out of the studies that were developed with a group of scientist peers that have been part of the process is a recognition that the highest loading period for phosphorus in the watershed takes place between January and March. And that's typically when if you think about it, in a typical season, our ground is dormant and vegetation is dormant. The ground is frozen. So your runoff rates when you have snow melt, or you have that weird warm snap we sometimes get in February or March, where everything warms up and you get rain and things like that. There's a lot of content that's being washed off the ground, and there's no mechanism in the landscape to capture it because the ground is still frozen, the vegetation's dormant. We get our highest loading happening then. So one of the things that the 3.0 report recommends is, can we develop a collection strategy that would allow us to, in the most intensive areas, collect the excess resources, the excess manure, the excess waste during this 3-month period, and find a way to pull that out of the system. Because what has to happen right now is that if, you know, as an example, a farmer has no place to put that manure other than to spread it on a field. And if you're spreading it on a frozen field, and then we get that warm snap, it's going to end up in the lake. So that is a big, as an example, one of the big recommendations of 3.0 is at a government level, how can we find a strategy for helping to collect that resource when they have excess nutrients, excess manure, and we need to get it out of the landscape or out of the watershed system.
Yeah, and I'll just add, that was great, Jay. I will just also add that Mark Rydell from the DNR did chime in as well with a really great comment. He said our farmers in the region have been making profound changes and adaptations to their operations to address these concerns, and their efforts are showing by far the largest improvement over recent years. So thanks for adding that too, Mark.
Yeah, I was going to mention that, Casey. I think what's happened the last 10 years is that we're trying a lot of different practices, everything from putting less manure on the land to when it goes on, where it goes on, even things like manure injection. The county is doing continuous cover crop. We've got the digesters up and running. But I think what the reality has come is that we're getting more rain. We've got all these good practices going on. We need to just ramp up how fast everybody's picking up those things, right? So there might be X amount of farmers that are doing manure injection. We want more to do that. We have X amount of people raking leaves out of the street. We want more people. So the compact has also started to inject not only that, recognizing that the good things that we're doing, but how can we do more of them at a faster rate to keep up with climate change?
Okay, well, we have about 4 minutes left. I want to get to 2, maybe 3 more questions. And this speaks to once this is adopted, Chuck is asking, after it's finalized, do the compact members adopt the plan and agree to implement recommended practices, or is this going to be a voluntary initiative?
So it's a really good question. I mean, the compact members, I believe, will sign on to the recommendations and will help, I guess, have committed to kind of helping facilitate and moving those things forward. But as we've discussed, the implementation is going to be across a broad spectrum of stakeholders. And so it's not just the 19 organizations that are part of the compact. Obviously, they are key players in kind of being the spearheads and the champions for those, and they will continue to be. But it's not just on them. I think it's on the larger community. I think there's a related question that Kip specifically asked of which specific government entities have the most power to make changes in this area, and where should we as citizens be exerting political pressure? I think that's an excellent question. One of the things that we are recommending, or one of the actions that we think residents and individuals can take, let's say you're not a major landowner, or you don't make policy at the state government level, but you're an individual. How can you kind of take a stand? One of them is putting political pressure on and/or contributing to organizations that are moving these things forward. I think those are important things that people can play a part of. Answering that question specifically, it's all of the above, right? It's everything from kind of the local municipality level to the county level, to all the way up to kind of the state level, especially as it relates to kind of finding and leveraging funding and resources. I think there needs to be strong advocates within the community to kind of help this get funded, because if we don't tell our politicians that this is important to us, the money won't get allocated there, right? And I see, James, you're nodding your head. Do you want to add some thoughts on that?
I think that's exactly right. I think the interesting thing about this is all solvable, right? This is not like we're doing something we don't know what to do. It's a lot like what's going on, globally about reducing the amount of coal and going to renewables. Do we want to do that in 2025? Do we want to do that in 2030? Do we want to do that in 2050? What is the community's willingness to do the work, spend the money, and train that cultural change to do this and get down to that threshold of currently on average, we have 110,000 pounds of phosphorus enter the lakes. And we need to get that down to about 47, 48, 50,000. And that's only the amount that the lake can tolerate. I mean, you can only eat so many Big Macs. At some point, you know, as much running around and treadmill you can do, we have to lower our intake. And setting that bar and being everybody very clear is that we need to reduce from 110,000 pounds down to 50,000 pounds. And it's going to take eating less, doing more, hitting the treadmill more, i.e., you know, raking leaves out of the street, changing practices in agriculture, doing more green infrastructure in our community. And we hope that this plan will roll out those options so everybody can participate and then eventually get to the goal that we all want: cleaner lakes and healthy communities.
All right. Well, thanks, James. Thanks, Cassie and Jay, for all of that. You know, there were a couple more questions I wanted to get to, but we are out of time, unfortunately. However, if you did have additional questions, I see one about zebra mussels. I see one if PFAS is going to be addressed in this. That's a whole nother can of worms, isn't it? Hopefully, we'll have future presentations on that. And of course, you can always email your questions to info@cleanlakesalliance.org. And Clean Lakes will forward the information to Cassie and Jay or answer it themselves to get that answer for you. So our next session coming up on November 10th, that's Wednesday, November 10th. Mark the calendars for that. Wait to be the next Clean Lakes 101 Science Cafe. And this gets more to an individual level. The topic is what you can do at your own home to help out the lakes. We touched on that a little bit here, but it's a little bit more of a broader pace. And then, you know, it'll be very exciting to hear about that too. So thanks again for joining us and hope you have a great rest of the day. Thanks again to our speakers, Cassie Goodwin and Jay Blue, coming to us and talking from SmithGroup. Everyone have a great day and stay safe.
Thank you, everyone. Great questions.
That's all.